Hi, and welcome along to tonight's webinar on returning to play. A very important topic at the moment, as there's many considerations in the coming weeks that us as coaches are going to need to consider when we're both delivering our training sessions and in the preparation phase as well. So tonight we're going to take you on a journey, and we're going to cover off a few items. So what I'll do is, before I get started, we are actually going live across Facebook tonight, and we're trying to put it via YouTube, but we're having a few technical difficulties with that at the moment. So we also are recording this workshop, and we'll load it live on our YouTube channel over the coming day, because it's something I think as coaches, this workshop, you're not going to need to refer back to it, especially when it comes to the protocols that are in place and in the regards to the return to training framework and how to design your activity sessions to meet that. So just let me share my screen, and we'll kickstart the presentation. All right, and I'll just move this out of the way. So again, it's a great one to be bringing you, because we're getting back to football now. Football over the next few weeks might look, and is going to look, a little bit than it will in a normal space. But I guess the good thing is that we're one step away from games resuming, and we're actually going to get to be on the park in a restricted capacity with our players, with the game that we love. So this is what we're working on tonight. We're going to look, and very much we're focusing on what training looks like in the coming weeks, because there's a number of considerations that as coaches, it's our responsibility to make sure that we're managing. Because first and foremost, as a game, we have to now work as a collective with the framework that we've been provided. And if we do that as a collective group, we've got a situation potentially within coming weeks that we can return to play and return to competition. But it's going to be the emphasis on you as coaches are going to need to manage and lead that. You're going to have to be the example for the other coaches within your club and the players within your team. So tonight, what we'll do, we'll start off, and we will be joined by a few guest presenters tonight. We'll be joined by Wendy Carter, our General Manager for Football Operations, and she's going to go through some of the training guidelines and the training framework that you as coaches are going to have to deliver. We'll then take a look at what structures of training and some training ideas, and we're going to look at what does it look like for discovery phase, skill acquisition phase, game training phase, and the performance phase. So no matter what age group you're working with, we're not going to give you session templates, but we're going to take you through some design considerations for activities, how you can structure and how you can deliver. And then maybe more applicable to the coaches that are working in the later years of the game training phase and with senior football, we'll be joined by Alini from Adelaide United Women's W League team, is also working out of Adelaide Uni, and she has recorded, because she can't be with us tonight, she has recorded a segment on how we bring players back into training after a training break. So again, all things that coaches, you are going to need to consider when you return to the training ground, either tonight or in the coming days. So really what we want to show you to start with is information around the Football SA Returning to Training framework. And it's been delivered in line with the RES documentation for level B, and it's referred to as the government's roadmap for stage 1 and getting sport back underway and rebooting it. So what we'll do is we'll go through, but you've got to remember as coaches that your job tonight is to contextualize all the information we're going to deliver, and you've got to take it and apply it to your own environment. And the biggest factor that's going to allow us to move forward as a sport is this one here. So as the coach, you need to have a clear understanding of the training protocol and what is required to be implemented. And so that's what we'll kickstart off with tonight. And then, as I said, we'll move through and we'll look at what we can deliver and how we can deliver it. So Wendy, are you online? Can you hear me?
I can hear you, Alec. How are you?
Good, good. And again, it's fantastic to be actually getting players onto a pitch in a restricted capacity, but it's better than where we have been over the last few weeks. I'm sure everybody feels the same.
Absolutely.
So what I'll do, Wendy, is I've got the slides here. So if I click through them, and if you can give all the coaches online a clear understanding about what we have to work within and the importance of it and why we have to implement this framework.
Okay. So welcome everyone. First and foremost, I think a big thank you to everyone within the football community for their patience, for working towards where we're at the moment. The AIS has put out a resumption of sport framework, and I'm not going to go into too much detail about this, except to say that we've actually used part of this, which is the level B, to put together the framework that we have developed for return to training stage 1 for Football SA. Alec, if you click on to the next one, this is probably more relevant. So what we've actually done, and I can't emphasize this enough, and I'll probably say it more times than you want to hear, but these, and there was probably a word at the start of this presentation that I should have picked up that cannot be used, and the word is guidelines. These are not guidelines. If you want to train, if your club wants to train, you have to implement what's in these regulations. And there's a couple of reasons behind that. One, probably from the day that we stopped football competitions, we have actually been working with government to work out how we're going to return. We've had 2 guiding principles all along, and the first guiding principle has been we will not return our sport until it's safe to do so. The second guiding principle has been that we want to return our sport in 2020, which we are in line to do. However, we need everyone within the football community to make sure they do the right thing. So these are regulations. They have to be implemented. And the only reason we've got this signed off on is because SA Health and the government has signed off on it. SAPOL has also signed off on it. So there is a lot of groups or stakeholders that have been involved in this to ensure that we can get our community back to playing football. It's probably not in the way that we want to at the moment, but it at least is getting people back on the park. So the first thing, and Alec is going to go through how you divide your field up. I'm not going to go into that. Alec will do that after I finish. But basically, and what I will also say is it's really important to remember that this is a fluid situation. No one's been in it before, and there's always things that are changing on a day-to-day basis. And I'll give you an example of that. Up until 2:45 today, we were made aware from SA government that the maximum number of participants in an area could only be 10. We've since 2:45 been told it can be 10 players plus 1 coach. So you can see that things are always changing. So first thing to be mindful of, you have to work in a group of no more than 10 players plus 1 coach. When you're actually working within that group, you have to still keep your social distancing. And because of the way we've split up the field, it does meet the density requirements, which is 1 person per 4 meters squared. In fact, it goes beyond that. But we want to, again, make sure that we put the health and safety of our participants at the forefront, I should say. This is the first stage back. There is to be no contact to contact. This is solely non-contact skill training drills, such as you can see on the screen, passing, shooting, heading. Again, being mindful of touching equipment. There is some sharing equipment, but we've got to keep it to a minimal in terms of touching that equipment. Again, this is all about transmitting of germs, viruses, etc. What is not permitted is, as I said before, contact to contact, any more than 10 plus a coach, and again, keeping the handling of equipment to a minimum. Thanks. In relation to your requirements, I will say that You are leaders at your club. You have to role model the behaviour and the requirements that we need you to do. As soon as that falls down, there is a possibility that training will actually be not sanctioned anymore. So I can't, as I said, I'll probably say this over and over again, I cannot stress how important it is for you to ensure these requirements are in place. The very first thing that you'll need to do is make sure you keep a record of your attendees. There's a rationale behind this. If there is an outbreak of COVID, if a player reports that they've got COVID, we need to trace who they've had contact with. And the way we will do that is come back to your records and see who that player has had contact with. And then SA Health will be able to make sure that they contact everyone that's been in contact with that person. So the keeping of records and the keeping of attendance is so important. We're actually going to be providing you with examples of record keeping sheets that you can use. So it's a template. If you want to keep the records in a different format, if you want to do it online, if you want to do it electronically, that's fine, but you need to do it. Any handling of the ball, try and keep it as minimal as you can. We know it's going to happen. Goalkeepers, they should be wearing gloves, and normally you might see a goalkeeper spitting on the gloves. One thing to be mindful of, if you see anyone spit, you'll need to get them out of that session. That's how strong you're going to have to be. Absolute no spitting. Try and get the goalkeepers to put sanitizer on their gloves. Don't ask me what that means in terms of, does it make the ball more slippery? I have no idea. You're going to have to work that one out. But again, this is all about safety for participants. There is no usage of changing rooms, gyms, any of the wet areas, any inside areas whatsoever at this stage one. At this stage. I will say this, however, especially for community clubs and those clubs that don't have medical facilities. If you've got a medical room, you can take an injured player into the medical room. Once you've treated that player, if you need to use it again, it needs to be sanitized. However, if you have no medical room, an injured player can be taken into a change room, but that's the sole purpose. And again, it's a safety issue, making sure we actually look after a player that's injured. Okay, as I said, no spitting at any time. Make sure there's no sharing of drink bottles. All players, and this should have been occurring even before the COVID came in, no sharing of drink bottles. Drink bottles should be individualised, labelled very clearly. The way we're approaching this is get in, train, get out. So as soon as training is finished, there is no socialising. If you need to talk to your players, don't do it at the training ground. If you're talking to junior players, phone up their parents, put it on the mic of your phone so that you're talking to the parent and the player at the same time. Again, this is all about social distancing, making sure that we don't have gatherings and making sure that we can actually bring back our sport in a progressive manner. Again, I will say you're the role models. A couple of things. Any breaches of this is not just a breach of Football SA regulations, it's actually a breach of government regulations. And I think the fines are something like $5,000 for an organisation and $1,000 for an individual. SAPOL has already been out to one of our clubs and visited, and I'm thankful to say they were doing the right things, but SAPOL is very much out there and making sure that people are doing the right thing. So one, you don't want to get a fine. Two, more importantly, you don't want to put the well-being and safety of any of your participants and any of your families at risk. And three, we want to get back to playing football, and we can only do that if we do the right thing. Anyone who's seen the television tonight will see that Football SA is one of the first sports to come back. Everyone will be watching us, whether it be government, whether it be other sports, whether it be public. We need to get this right. And I can't reiterate this any more than what I'm saying now. You have a responsibility to make sure you do the right thing.
Thanks, Wendy. And again, I think it is a privilege as a sport to be able to come back before everybody else. And we definitely have as coaches, we have an ownership to make sure that we take it in the right direction. So if there's coaches on here that have questions around the framework, around the requirements, in the first instance, and then if the club needs something,
so if any of we had a Zoom meeting with all clubs at 4 o'clock today, and we went through basically exactly what I've just gone through. In addition to that, there were some clubs that had some questions. We were able to answer those questions for the club. If in the first instance you've got a question, not sure about something, I would urge you to speak to your club. Don't go in there and guess, because again, if you're wrong, there's so much riding on this. Don't take the risk. So speak to your club first. If they can't answer it, we've already directed them to come and contact us. And if we don't know, we've got a direct line to SAPOL, who will we can send questions to them and they can come back to us. So all I'm saying in relation to this, if you don't know, don't guess, ask. Because we want to make sure that we have a progression into competitions. When that is, we're hopeful it could be as early as June, but all of our directions will come from government.
Cool. And these documentations, if you've logged in tonight via Zoom and you've registered as a participant, will be emailed out to you. If you're logged on via Facebook, they can be downloaded off Football SA website. And we'll make sure that you know where you can access those. Thanks for your time, Wendy, and outlining about what we need to do as coaches to make sure that we, first of all, get back underway in the right manner, using the framework, and then if we all take a shared responsibility, then we put ourselves as a sport in a good position to resume games and competition sometime in the near future.
Can I just finish off by saying again is that the sport has done really, really well to get to this point. If during, and even parents, we've given some directive to clubs about parents. There's only one parent that can drop their child off at training and then they've got to go and sit in the car. So everyone's got some obligations they need to follow. One of the things, if you know what players are like, especially junior players, they like to have a chat. They like to mill around. If you see that happening, move them on, get them to go home. Remember, get in, train, get out. That's the motto that we need to reinforce.
Cool. Fantastic. Thanks, Wendy. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks, guys. Good luck with everything.
Yeah. All right. So what we'll do, we'll move on. And because that's an important start we had to make to the workshop so people clearly understand about the framework that we've got to work within. So what we want to do now is go through a potential training structure. So I guess that first segment, those are the recommendations, those are the frameworks you have to follow. From this part on, here is one way that potentially as a coach you can structure your practices, and then we'll go through on sort of potentially how you can design activities for the various stages. So this is just now, before was you have to follow. This is here's a potential structure, and here's a potential design requirements that you can put into place to make sure you can still deliver sessions that are going to help our players develop. So as we know, there's many different ways that we can structure and design a practice. But we think at the moment, because of the uniqueness about the number of players that are allowed to train at one time and with one coach, then we are recommending that coaches look to implement what we call a carousel practice, which basically can divide the team up into small working groups and they'll rotate around a number of activities. So this is what it can look like here. So you could bring your players in. I'm just going to minimize this down so it gets it out of the way. You can bring your players in and do a group warm-up, but obviously making sure that players will stay away from each other and make sure you're satisfying social distancing. And then you can take them through, either rotate around a series of activities, or as a group, the players rotate from one to the other. And then at the end of the session, you bring them down and you have a cool down again, making sure that there's social distancing. And then some of the reasons why we feel maybe at the moment this is an appropriate session structure. Again, it's ideal for working with small numbers and small working groups. And it can maximize the training time, so time on task for your players. I think at the moment, we're going to have to make sure that our sessions are short and they're varied. And so that's how we can fully engage a player. There's nothing going to be worse as a player, because we're going to be limited to what we can, that they're going to sit in an activity that's going to go for 20 or 30 minutes. So we might need to design activities which they rotate through, keep them short and sharp, and keep them engaged. And its ability to deliver activities related to each of the attacking core skills. And there's also an ability to quickly flow between them. So I'm going to outline 4 different training options and how you could use a carousel practice. So the first one is you set up 5 activities. Each put the groups into 3 or 4 players. Now, one of the things that I'll touch on now is when I've designed the presentation, was working off the guideline that it was 9 players and 1 coach. So some of the activities that we'll show will reflect that, whereas Wendy said before, that's changed late this afternoon to now 10 plus 1, and that being the coach. And then, so put them into the stations, and then what they do is they rotate around the stations. So they rotate around a practice that's focused on the different core skills. A second training option might be, splitting the groups into now groups of 5, as opposed to what I had on screen when it was 9 players. And again, they deliver activities on the core skills for 10 to 15 minutes per activity. And then the coach, if you need to, if you've only got 9 players, you can act as the 10th player and be a server in one of the activities if needed. And what you can do is you can set up and deliver the first 2. The players then will swap over and experience the other activity. Then you can send them away for a drinks break. And also in the protocol and the framework, you'll see that there's also got to be times you can practice with hygiene and using hand sanitizers. You can set up the next 2 activities. They come back, they experience the activities, they swap back over, and then you bring the training to a close into a cool down. Option 3 is this: if you want to work in a group of, well, it says 9 on the screen, but now that's 10 plus the coach. And here you might deliver sort of larger sized activities, still keep all social distancing alive. And again, activities around, maybe for this is more for your senior players and your youth players, around core skills or a key principle. And then again, the coach can act as the 11th player or a serving player if needed. So here again, it's activity 1, send them for a drink, hand sanitizer. Activity 2, bring them back, send them away. Activity 3, send them out. Activity 4. Again, the downside of this one though is with the training space, unless you can set up all 4 activities, that you might have to move cones, which might decrease the flow of your session. And the last one would be to split them up into small working groups, and then finish with a social distancing game, a modified game. And again, players can do the first 3 activities and rotate round, and then we can bring them back for the whole group, and we have a modified game which makes sure that players are still social distancing. And in the presentation shortly, we'll get into that and how they might look like, because it's about using corridors, using zones which have defenders in them, but that restrict their movement so they can't go on and press to win the ball. But we can still keep them alive in a defending scenario. So what I might do is, if I've got Dan Cook, who is currently completing a PhD in skill acquisition. For those that have been on some of our previous webinars, that Dan helped deliver one a number of weeks back on the power of play and bringing some of the research that he's done alive and how we can learn from that. So Dan, we've just outlined carousel practices. I know this is something you've used. So what benefits do you see in this type of structure for our coaches that are returning to play?
Yeah, thanks for having me back, Al, and good to see everybody again. Obviously, it's really interesting time for all of us coming back to coaching under these extreme constraints with what's going on with the pandemic right now. So yeah, that's got to be the priority. It's got to be number one. And as we're looking to come back through using a carousel, there's a couple of things that stand out for me, which is one is I was already touched on, which is engagement. So from a cognitive standpoint, the getting in and getting out and getting in and getting out and changing activities actually suits the age group that we're working with. From a cognitive standpoint, they can pay attention and then go find something else to do, pay attention, go find something else to do. So as we're moving through the 4 activities. And the second thing is from a physical capacity standpoint is they're really bursty kids. So they can go 100 million miles an hour, I'm sure, as you know, when you work with them. and then they need to drop off again, 100 million miles an hour, drop off again. So this session design structure actually facilitates that and allows for that, for them to go really intense into an activity and then step out and have a break, really intense into the second activity, step out and have a break. So I think, you know, with the constraints that were placed under with what's going on, I think Carousel is a good option, also aligning to what's best for the children at this time as well.
Yeah, and you talk about children, but say youth players and senior players, a methodology or a coaching a delivery method that also works with them?
Yeah, absolutely. And as you go through into the older age groups, as you move into youth and senior football, you can just think about how, from a physical standpoint, which I know we have coming a little bit later in the presentation, but how you might time the amount of time that you're spending in each area and progress that over the weeks and use that as kind of a conditioning progression. As a lot of people have obviously been more sedentary than normal over the past 6 weeks, so getting back to football is going to be quite a high injury risk. So we can start a little bit lower with the load that we're giving them, and we can control that quite nicely through the different areas of the carousel and look to progress that as we hopefully return to competition sooner rather than later.
And last one, Dan, from my understanding, this is the carousel. It's quite common in PE curriculums, and it's something that especially children at school are quite used to.
Yeah, so there's many roads lead to Rome, but the carousel is one that the children will be familiar with, and the reason that it's used quite commonly within school environments is what I touched on earlier, is attention span and the physical capacity. So yeah, it should be one that they align with pretty nicely.
Cool. And if this is the first webinar that you have tuned into, so Dan delivered one, I think it was about 3 or 4 weeks ago for us, and brought some of the requirements about really engaging junior players and how to structure activities to bring the play out and use that as the learning factor. So if you haven't seen that, you can click onto our Football South Australia YouTube channel, and it is uploaded there, because there will be a few things that we do tonight and we talk through that will refer back to some of the previous webinars that we have delivered. So if you're not sure that what we're referring to, there's a good chance to jump online and have a look at some of the other webinars that we have delivered over the last 6 to 7 weeks. So this is also why we're also recommending a carousel practice, because as Wendy alluded to before, we've got to make sure that when players are in a training environment that we're satisfying social distancing. So as a sport and as Football South Australia, we've had sign off around here. So you can split a full-size training pitch into 3 working areas, or you can split it into 3 working areas this way as well. And depending on what your club has training space-wise, if you could split a group of 20 players over 2 halves with 1 coach. If you want to split into groups of 3, so work with 30 players, you must use one of the 2 examples on screen. So now we've talked about how we can potentially structure practice. Yeah. Let's have a look at some of the training activities. And what we're going to do here is we're going to show you some design considerations about how you could structure your session to fun of all engaged players, that's age appropriate, and also to keep perception, decision, execution, and the full moments of the game alive. But just I thought before we got stuck into that, I've asked one of our community coach developers, Matt Bennett, to prepare something. So Matt's a coach that I've spoke to on a regular occurrence over the last 8-9 weeks, and I know has attended not only these webinars, but a lot of webinars that's put on by other groups in Australia and then outside our boundaries as well. So what I thought I'd do is just get him to share some of the ideas that he's picked up over the last, say, 8-9 weeks, and how it's used to bring into his own training environment, and how it's affected him and how he's changed along the journey. Because I think there's a really powerful message and a really powerful story how he's taken on board knowledge and then gone and applied it in his own environment. So I'm just going to stop my screen here. That's not Matt. Dan, you're still on screen, but Matt, are you there?
I am, Alec. Can you hear me?
Yep, I've got you. I've got you. So yeah,
thank you very much.
Yeah, please share with us. Share us about your journey for the last 8 weeks and for information that you've picked up from various sources. How have you applied it to your own design of practices? And what can sort of coaches take on board and what can you share with them? So I'll leave it to you.
Yeah, thanks very much. Thanks, Alec. Well, look, firstly, thanks for these webinars because I think they've been a really great initiative. And what I'd like to do is just to share with you a little bit about my journey during this period and what these webinars have in fact done for me. Primarily what they've done is they've opened a whole lot of doors and they've given me a lot of different topics for consideration, things that I can go and think about and learn a bit more about. And for example, the conditioning presentation from Eleni a few weeks back, which I thought was sensational, provoked me to go back and reread a bit of Raymond Verheijen's football periodization book and have a think myself about how things like football conditioning happen within the football context. But probably more so, there was one particular webinar that struck a chord with me. I think it was the second one. It was, in fact, it was the one which Alec and Dan, so thanks Daniel, presented, which was on harnessing the power of play, I think. And that really struck a chord with me. More so, a particular topic within it struck a chord, and that was the topic of PDE and getting PDE into our training. And PDE, perception, decision, execution, is a particular topic in training that's a real big interest of mine. And so I wanted to think about how I could introduce PDE into the current lockdown conditions. Now, bearing in mind that was what was that, a few weeks ago, so we were in that situation where you were allowed 2 people, or I think there was a family member plus another person at the time. And at that point, I was receiving 100 videos of individual skill sessions and toe taps and juggling. And I don't know about you, but geez, I was getting real bored of it. I'm thinking to myself, I think we can do more. I think I can do more as a coach. And I wanted to challenge myself to try and find ways of introducing PDE into that current situation. It coincided with some schools that I work for asking me to supply some online content for their football teams. And again, I just wanted to do a little bit more than supply something with toe tap tutorials. I wanted to introduce PDE and introduce that into these current restrictions. So what I'd like to do, I'll just share that journey and the thought process. So before I do, I'm just going to bring up a graphic here. Please excuse me a moment. I'm not the most technical fella. So let me just press the right buttons. Okay, can everyone see that?
Yep, it's on my screen.
Fantastic. Okay. All right. Look, just before we get going, I wanted to talk very, very quickly about PDE, what PDE meant for me, and I wanted to really think about it because before I could try and think about how I could implement it into a restricted training session, I wanted to analyze it. So I'm not going to go through this in great depth, but I started to come up with this this chart myself. So this is my own creation to think about perception, which is the assessment of a moment. Can we take pictures? Can we visual, audio, touch? How can we evaluate the situation, which becomes a decision. The decision making, we're looking for the best solution to solve the problem. It could be simple, complex. Sometimes it happens within the context of a tactical arrangement within the team. And all that then that gets constantly reevaluated, and then that all leads to execution. And execution, physical execution of a skill, of a technique, which requires things like motor ability, fitness, aerobic and anaerobic. And I started thinking about this to myself, well, okay, if PDE is a football action, if this is what footballers do, that's the holistic aspect of football, then my training should be holistic. And I started to think to myself how much of my training time is spent on that whole picture. When I thought about it, look, is that quite a large part of my training time is spent in this area of the picture. So, physical is about execution, especially in the skill acquisition phase, where I work in skill acquisition and in game training phase. And in game training phase, you can see that sort of that circle goes over into tactical a little bit. So there was a little bit of tactical consideration. So, I could see straight away that within my own training, I wasn't training holistically. And so, given those restrictions, which at the time, as I say, I think there were 2 family members, or 1 family member and 2 people. I got to working on a project, and I enlisted the help of a good friend of mine, a really talented coach, and his son, who is actually a very talented under-18s player. And we thought about how could we create solo sessions that included some PDE. So how can I do something for an individual footballer that created some PDE while still working on these core skills? And over the next period of weeks, we worked together to undertake this. So we started with the premise that we would use 4 core skills and therefore 4 drills. Now, I hate that word drill, but I can't think of another way of describing what we did, so we're going to call it a drill. So 4 drills. So we had core skills, which were first touch, much like the skill acquisition, dribbling, shooting, those sorts of things. And we looked at how we could introduce PD into those. And what I'd like to do now is just to show you a couple of those sessions very quickly. I won't show you them all. Okay, so drill number 1. So drill number 1 of the 4, first touch and PDE. And what we wanted to do, as I say, is to work on that player's first touch, but introduce some decision making. You can see from this graphic the setup, which was a quick 10 by 10, 4 goals. Those goals actually had colour cones either side. In fact, we didn't even use goals. We just used the coloured cones. And then there was a corner cone as well. So we had a blue goal, a blue corner, a red goal, a red corner, and on and on and on. I'm at the top there in the blue outfit with the balls at my feet, and the player is inside this small square of cones in the centre. And what we did was I would play the pass into the player, and at that time I would call a colour. So in this instance on the diagram, red. And what the player has to do is to shoot or pass the ball through the red cones at the goal, and then run around the red corner cone and come back. By which time I'm ready to play the next one in, and I could play the ball in. I could call any colour we wanted: yellow, red, or blue, or green. Look, we found this to be quite good. We found that the player worked. If we look at this area here that I've described as player positives, player works on first touch, striking the ball. So was it good in terms of skill acquisition? Was it good in terms of core skill? Yes, it was. Did we bring some extra PDE into it? Yes, just a little bit of PDE, in the sense that the player needed to scan around, have a look, build a visual picture of where the cones were. But one thing we did find was that the picture didn't change. So consequently, once the player had scanned around and knew that the red cone was in that corner, if he had a good memory, he didn't need to look around again. So nothing changed in front of him, and that became unrealistic in the sense that football never happens in that kind of static visual, does it? The picture's always changing, that's the key. So the key for us was, could we introduce more variables into this same drill that would increase or force an increase in perception and amount of decisions, and that was the challenge for us. One thing also just quickly is that we also worked out that we could add quite a good conditioning element into this drill by varying the size of the pitch, the time that we ran for, and rest periods in between. So that's something I'd like to work on and experiment with more in the future, but there is a possibility to use this for conditioning. So we introduced some progressions, and the progressions weren't necessarily sequential, and I won't go into great detail, but the first one, all that changed was that I moved around the zone, and what that did was it forced an extra scan from the player, because what I would do is I would move as he was running around the final cone. So he'd have to look over his shoulder to find out where I was. So we'd increase the perception situation. Progression 2, I would call 2 colours. One would be the goal to shoot through, and the second would be the cone to run around. And that just created an increase of information. So it didn't actually change the picture, but what it did do was load the information on the decision-making part of the process. Number 3, I'd call a colour, and then I'd hold up the cone. So exactly the same as progression 2, but they then have to look. Now what happened here was I would shout red, for example, the player would shoot into the red goal, and then I would wait until they were halfway through the action of shooting before I held the cone up for green, for the corner. And this forced the player to scan their shoulder and actually start the PDE process for the next football action while the previous one was working, which was quite a big sort of load of information on the player. And that worked really well. But the best one absolutely was progression 4, where we introduced the player's father as to become a passive defender, and there he is in his nice little salmon pink outfit. look, as I said, he's a very able coach, so he knew his remit. His remit was not to defend, it wasn't to get in the way, it wasn't to try and win the ball. He literally walked around inside that square with the sole intention of trying to influence the player. And what this did was made the player firstly have to scan their shoulder to see where that defender was. So the rule of this final progression was that I would play the ball in and I would call a colour for the goal, but the player was able to choose whichever corner they wanted to run around. The only rule was they couldn't run around the same corner twice in a row, and they had to go through all colours in one progression. So the player has to scan their shoulder now, see what's going on with the defender. They have to scan their shoulder to remind themselves of where the colour cones are. They have to think about that order of the colour cones. So here we've got P, we've got D, and of course then we've got execution of the first touch skill. So we never ever lost the execution part in the first touch in the PDE. So that was drill number one. As I said, there were four drills in total. So there was one on dribbling, one on shooting. I won't go into those, but what I will touch on very quickly is the final one, drill number 4, which we entitled Passing with PDE. And again, this one worked really, really well for conditioning as well. Set up a square, 7 by 7, and a supply of balls on the outside. And what you'll see this time is we did need both myself and the other coach. So I'm at the top, other coach at the bottom. We're on the outside of that square, players on the inside. Very, very simply, I would play the ball into the player and I had 2 cones in my hand, a blue one and a red one. If the player sees me holding the blue cone up, he has to bounce the ball back to wherever it's come from, be that me or the other coach. If I hold the red one up, the player has to play through to the other coach. So really, really simple. I pass the ball in, I'm holding the blue one up and we're bouncing the ball between us, and then eventually I flip the red one up and he has to play through to the other coach. And what then happened was that the 2 coaches, we both started moving around the zone. So the player was forced to just be looking over his shoulder constantly. And we really enjoyed this one. We found there was a great deal of PDE in there. Really, really wonderful to see a player, a talented under-18s player who I've watched, and like a lot of players of that age, probably doesn't scan his shoulder anywhere near enough. And to see him looking round as much as he did, and it was fantastic. It was like watching Xavi. Really, really encouraging. So lots of PDE worked really, really well. And we really, really enjoyed that drill as well. So that's just a bit of a look at what we did. And, the project was a lot bigger than just this. This is just a snapshot of it. But just to round up, my piece on here, and thanks very much, Alec, for having me, is really just to say, whatever the restrictions are, I think if you're creative about this, as a coach, you can still introduce good, realistic football training. It doesn't have to be just I'm going to pass to him and a static passing practice. I think there's more that we can do, and for me, I saw this as a challenge during the period. I now see this next set of restrictions as a challenge. I'm working furiously now to try and get some more stuff ready with this 10 player situation, and that's a challenge for me. So yeah, look, thanks very much, Alec, and thanks for the webinars. And, one of the things I said right at the start was that for me, it opened a whole lot of doors as possibilities to look down. And what I'd recommend to you as coaches is if there's something in a webinar that's provoked you to think about something, go off and explore it, because, I think there's lots to learn. So, yeah, thanks very much, Alec.
Yeah, if you can just stop your screen sharing, and then we can get the camera back up.
Sure. There we go.
Fantastic. So no, thanks for sharing that information with us. And I think it's really appropriate at the moment, because yes, we're going to go back to team trainings, but they're going to have quite an individualistic approach to them, given that the social distancing factors that we're going to need to all apply and the framework that we're going to work within. So I think you're a good example of a coach who's using this period as, yes, it's going to be challenging, but you're looking at it in a positive light and going, well, actually, I can develop myself as a coach. So I'd encourage all coaches out there to have sort of that thought about themselves and about what they do around designing activities over the coming weeks. So just before, I thought we'll move on and have a look at what some potential activities we could use over the coming weeks. I thought we'd just get Dan on screen. Dan being a specialist in skill acquisition. Just any key messages that you want to reiterate around what Matt's just presented about, especially maybe the use of audio cues or visual cues?
Yeah, I thought what stood out for me was, it's great that Matt's used this period for self-reflection and has noticed something in his training that he'd like to develop, and that being the idea of perception. And I think the thing that stood out for me, Matt, in your session there was noticing how or what the player was perceiving and if that was relevant to the game of football. So, for example, you had the ball played into them and then they were just turning around and seeing the cones, but the cones weren't actually moving. So the player would never see that picture in football. It would always be moving. The opposition, the opponents who they're up against would always be changing. So as you went through that thought process, you replaced or added the defender in there. So obviously at this moment we can't tackle. We're under the constraint of health and safety. But the idea that you added the defender in there, that information that the player in the middle now receiving was actually seeing is more relevant to the game of football. So therefore their action, to come back to the execution of the football action, is therefore more likely to transfer back to the game of football, which we all end up wanting to play. So I thought it was really nice how you went through that thought process, and you could see how it became more like football by the time we got to the end of it, which was, really cool.
Cool. So what we'll do now, Dan, is I've got some potential examples that what we could design training around, and then so what I'll do is maybe introduce them for each of the phases of development, and then maybe you jump on board at the end and give us some other considerations that coaches could take into account, or how we could just make them better maybe.
Yep, sounds good.
All right, well, I'll just pull back my screen back up and I'll get to the right place. So again, we're going to be in an environment it's very different to how we've normally trained in, and we know that often when we take an isolated approach, we kind of neglect all the four corners of holistic development. And I think what Matt showed there was a really good example of how even when you're training with an individual player, how you can keep some of the other things alive. So we've got to make sure in this period now that even though we're going to be in a restricted capacity, that we just don't want to separate out and work on each corner individually. We still want to bring them back and try and work on them together and make sure that there's considerations in our practices that a player has to think about each of the corners. So again, where possible, if you're designing small training activities with minimal players, how can we still include perception, decision, execution? So the players having to take in a football picture before deciding how they're going to execute, and then actually going through the process of executing. And again, we might, in this block of training, we might focus more heavily on one of the corners, but still have a way to keep the other three corners alive. And we'll go through some detail about how potentially we can do that. I want to touch on one thing. I think over the coming weeks, coaches are going to have to start getting an idea of and really using to the best of their ability. And it's about the concept of interference. So in some of our workshop, we've talked about the difference between what is technique and what is skill. And to sum it up quickly, well, technique is basically executing one of the football actions. So it's getting the ball from one player to another. And if we took it at a really basic level, we'll see coaches out there, players in lines passing the ball back and forward. They're just repeating the passing technique. But we know that skill is all to do with selecting the right technique when under pressure. So again, if you're playing a game, we all would have played when we were children, was, piggy in the middle, because you've got a direct opponent. Now you're having to use deception, fakes to try and get the outcome that you want. And you might select different techniques. Instead of just being a side foot pass, you might bend it with the inside of the foot, outside of the foot. You might use a little bit of a fake or some deception to try and play and nutmeg the opponent, or you might decide to play over. So you're selecting the right technique given the situation in front of you, generally, and it refers to opposition players. So we can add what we call interference. So if you look on screen, the red player is the defender and is having direct opposition to the blue players playing backward and forward. So they're having to take into account the defender's movement when they're playing the ball to make sure they get a successful outcome. because the defender here is only defending the blue, but is still moving and is getting in the way of the yellow players. The yellow players, even though they're not under direct pressure, are still having to think about when they pass, how they pass, and even how hard they pass to make sure that it doesn't hit the defender on the way. So again, if there's a moving obstacle, it means that there's decisions are made, decisions are available, but we're out direct pressure. And in the framework that we've seen, we're not going to be allowed to have tackling, we're not going to be allowed to have defenders pressing the ball. So we're going to have to try and use the concept of interference to continue to make perception, decision, execution actions for players. And then intermittently in this situation, if the defender was to turn side on and change and try and go after the ball with the yellow players, they are now under direct pressure. So they're working on a skill where the blue players now go into interference. They've still got decision making, but without direct pressure. And I think it's a concept that we're going to have to really get to understand as a coach to make sure that, especially in the skill acquisition, the game training and our performance phases, that we use it in our session design to make them as live and game realistic as possible, given the restrictions that we're going to face. So I think for me, it comes back to the constraint-led approach when you're designing your activities. And we know that the environment will constrain and have limiting factors on a practice. Individuals around the physical and their mental fatigue will constrain the practice. But I think in our current situation, we're going to really have to think about how we use pitch sizes and areas to maintain social distancing, use conditions and rules to limit what a defender can do to make sure that we don't put a player in a situation where they potentially end up with contact, and looking at attacker-defender ratio and point systems. And we're going to have to really challenge ourselves to use these tasks and change these tasks to develop practices that still have game realism and are based on game scenarios, especially for the skill acquisition, the game training, and the performance phase for senior football. So Dan, I know this is an area of specialty for yourself. So just potentially from your perspective, anything else to add about what coaches can do in the coming weeks?
Yeah, so I think just to go a little bit deeper on this slide is, this slide's based off the idea that players, there isn't an ideal playing technique. So how you pass a ball is there isn't only one way to do it. So what we can do is to facilitate players to display their own movement solutions, so their own way to pass the ball. We can look to control these different constraints, so the idea of the environment, the individual, and the task. Obviously, it's difficult for us to constrain the environment unless anybody knows how to make it sunny all the time. If you do, then I want to get some information from you. There's the individual, so it depends on the physical characteristics, their condition, how tall they are, their weight, all these sorts of things. And then there's the task, as Al's touched on here. And the task is really what we can look to utilise within our sessions. And the two that I'd always come back to, if you think, oh, how can I do this? Just trying to keep it as simple as possible, is always think about how you can control space and time for a player, because that sits at the core of football. Is it's all about space and time. So if I'm looking at the previous, can you go back one slide out, just to show you your previous? So if I'm looking at that middle game there, and I'm thinking, right, they seem to be doing okay here, there's not much challenge for them. If I'm thinking about space, how could we make that more challenging for them? Well, I might move the distance between the two blue players backwards, so then now the passing distance that they have to complete is greater. So that's using a task constraint to increase the challenge for those players. One might be time, so it might be we play a game for 30 seconds. Who can get the most passes in 30 seconds, blues or yellows? So now I'm using the idea of time to place pressure under the players. Obviously, we've lost our best weapon in coaching, which is an opponent. But we need to get creative in these times. And I think keeping it simple and making sure we can action on it is just come back to the core concepts of space and time, and how you can use that to either turn the heat up and make it more challenging, or you may need to go the other way and make things a little bit simpler for your players.
Cool. All right, thanks, Dan. Well, what we'll do, we'll move on. We'll just get through here. So we talked about it before in our carousel practice, was to get the players, get them started in a warm-up. And what we're encouraging coaches to do is, for whatever age group you've got, is to take them through an adapted version of the FIFA 11 workshop. So if you're working with players that are sort of in the game training phase or in the senior phase, what we'd ask you to do is to take the FIFA 11, adapt it, and deliver it so there's social distancing and remove any body contact. And then if you're working with junior players, and last week we touched on what our fundamental movement patterns and our fundamental skills in our webinar and our Monday night workshop. So again, the FIFA 11 Plus for kids is going to implement that and make sure that we're covering those off, which are important for junior players, because if a player doesn't have the fundamental movement patterns, they're not able to develop the fundamental skills, then they can't develop the football specific skills on top. And think about it, the fundamental movement patterns and the fundamental skills are the foundation for football players. So what we're talking about is, and we'll make sure that you get a copy, either if you're on the Zoom link, we'll send it out to you. If you're watching via Facebook, we'll make sure this gets posted, a copy of this presentation, onto our Football South Australia website, so you can download this and you can click on and it will bring up the documentation for each of the warm-ups. And again, it's to just adapt it to make sure that there's no contact. So for those that are familiar with the 11 plus, there's exercises in there which is called partner circling, where they'll laterally move around each other. Well, we can just replace that by making sure they're working around a cone which still is distance apart to keep social distancing. And again, one of the other activities is called shoulder contacts, where instead of coming in, jumping up and contacting in the air before they land, they can just come in, work to the cone, jump up, land before moving back to the blue cones. So we can take these warm-ups and adapt them to make sure that players remain that 1.5 metres away from each other at all times, and adapt or modify any activities that involve player contact. You've taken through that, and now here's when you might want to take them into an activities, either one of the 4 ways which we outlined how you could deliver a carousel practice. So again, we're going to focus the first recovery phase. So again, just fun games, fundamental movement patterns, fundamental skills, and just get them being active and just get them back playing. And again, for those that tuned in last week, you'll remember this. Make sure we build the house up the right way around. Really work on those fundamental skills and fundamental movements. So I'm going to show you a couple of activities. So many of you have seen this one before, where you get players in pairs and put them in lines and they play the ball backwards and forwards to each other, which again is working on a technique, but for a junior player, it's not going to be very enjoyable and the boredom's going to set in pretty quickly. But we can use this as the basis of a practice while also including PDE. So what all you're going to do is take this practice, put an end zone at each end, and put a player in. Now, as the players now play back and forward, they're just going to bounce the ball. What we want to do is have that player run through, and every time they get through the opposite end zone, they get a point. Now, as they're running, the passer's going to try and play the ball to hit them below the knee. And if they get hit, they're out. And it's about how many points or how many times they can move from one end to the other. Now, if we're designing this activity, the players, the red ones on the side, when they're passing, their decision about the speed of their pass or when they pass is all going to be related to the yellow player. So even though it's a fun activity, it's setting some football technique work, but it's also using a level of PDE because they're trying to hit the yellow player that's moving. And all it is simply is just rotating players in and out of being the runner. And so what I make sure is on the document that we release is that a full description of how the activities will work. And then what you can do now is potentially, if you want to increase it, add a ball, change the challenge point. Now, as the player moves up and down, instead of trying to hit the yellow player, you're trying to hit the ball in front of them. So it's a smaller target, so harder for the passing players on the outside. Another one, again, taking social distancing into account, is something that I've just called drag race. The kids pretend, that the red are a car and that the football's their engine. And I think with the players in the discovery phase, we can really encapture that imagination by giving the games a storyline and all they're just playing to the story. So you're going to be a racing car, you're going to be a drag racer, and it's about going from the garage at one end to be the first one to go down the road and park at the car park at the other end. And so what they could do is on the coach say it's go, or hold up a green bib, or the players then drive down and they drive down the course. And they've got to keep in their lane. They can't cross lanes because we'll end up with having an accident. So again, they're racing down, and when the coach says stop, they've got to stop with their foot on the ball. If they can't stop with the foot on the ball, they return back to their garage and they start again. And again, it's the concept of a race all the way down from the garage at one end to the car park at the other. And then as the players get used to just by audio cues, you could use visual cues, could be your hand, which you put up as a stop sign and then put down, or it could be using a cone or a bib, green for go, red for stop. So having to visually see, there's a visual prompt. There might be another one here, which I've called bowling balls, where split the players up into end zones and have them working between cones to ensure social distancing. And then what they're going to do is try and strike their ball and hit the cone. And every time they do so, they get a point for their team, or as a point of an individual. And then your job at the coach is just to make sure that the balls have been returned back to the end so the players can continually go, and standing the cones back up. If you've got an older group and you want to take that a step further, potentially you could add some defenders, and they face the opposing team. Now they can move across, and if they can block and pass the ball back to the opposite group. So the red player can block the ball and play it back to the yellow group to have another go. So again, now the players got to think about when to pass, how to pass, and how hard to pass as well. So Dan, what I'll do is just get you to jump back in there. Again, just 3 activities, how we can keep social distancing with junior players, but still keep some version alive of PDE at a minimal level. So they're still having to think about how they execute. What's your thoughts, and what can you add?
Yeah, some really nice ideas, mate. I think the first thing, you put the most important thing on the first slide, which I think you said fun or joy. That's the ultimate, is, that's for us too as coaches, is it's not just fun for the kids, it's got to be fun for us as well. So keep that at the heart of your design. And as Al touched on there, is PDE he's come up with some really nice ideas here for this session, and there's a lot of pressure on us as coaches to adapt and come up with these creative ideas of how we can train. But never forget that we've got loads of incredible minds within our session. So yeah, go with your basic idea. However, always turn it over to the children. Ask them, how could we do this differently? How could we increase the challenge? How could we decrease the challenge? And then just guide them to make sure that what they're coming up with is including PD&E. So you'll be amazed with what they'll come up with. They'll come up with some crazy ideas, and then just try and be like a bit of a guide for them on how it still includes PD&E, so we know that they're developing skill along the way. But yeah, I highly recommend asking the children.
And Dan, would it be fair that we're going to have to design an activity to keep the social distancing, but if you can keep that into the game structure, into the storyline, the players won't even know that's what you're doing?
Yeah, exactly. You keep them engaged, you sell it to them, you build this amazing picture inside their mind, and they don't even need to know all the ins and outs and the details and the pressure that we're put under to design and under these circumstances. Yeah.
Cool. Well, what we'll do, we'll flip through to if you're a coach working with skill acquisition age group. And again, remember, it's about developing football skills with the context of the game, which is going to take a little bit more thought power at the moment, because we still want to make sure that we're working on developing the functional game skills. So again, we need players to be in an environment where they're seeing a picture, they're deciding what to do, and then they're deciding and seeing how good they are at executing. So what we'll do is I'll bring the activities on board, and then we'll sort of maybe touch on a couple of the ways where PDE is involved in the practice. So the first one here is more of a blocked practice, and it's around striking the ball. So you work in here in pairs, and then if you've got more players, you could be a waiting station, and you could have sort of 3 groups per team, which takes care of what's that, 9 players. So what they can do is they're going at the same time, but they can bounce the ball 4 times, and then the player plays it beyond. Now, after they've been played beyond, the player turns and goes through, and now, depending on where they want to strike the ball from, and again, depending on how close they are to the goal, they choose their challenge. It depends on how many points they are worth. And it can be a race between the yellow team and the red team to be the first one to score to get the points. So again, if you go back, both teams going at the same time, bounce the ball 4 times, play through, the player then makes a forward run and decides from what zone. Obviously, the further out, the harder it's going to be for them. And they collect points, and it's a race to get the points. Then you could think, well, actually, now I'm going to bring in a way that it's going to be a little bit more competition. If I'm this yellow player, instead of just scoring in my own goal, you might bring to life a rule where if actually they score in the opposition's goal, they get 3 points, but also the other opposition team loses 3 points. So again, you can manipulate point structures and rules to bring different things to life and to allow the player to choose their own challenge level. And if a player's lacking confidence, they might choose to score a 1 point zone. If the player's got more confidence, they're choosing to score from the 3 point zone. So again, they're in control. So again, and here in this practice, it's the perception, decision, execution. It's really about looking to see where the other player is, the player that they're playing against. And they might choose that actually they're in front of me, so I'm shooting from further out. Another one here focused on striking the ball. And again, when we play and we combine and passing in a game, it's because we want to move the ball around the defender. So here's where we might be able to bring a passive defender alive in an intercept zone. So the player's restricted to that middle area and can't come out. And so what can happen here in this activity is that the players can play the ball to each other, and then they're trying to bypass the red player to get it to the opposite end. But the defender can move, and the ball moves across. And because the defender's moving, if the defender wins the ball, we want something to recreate a game for them and to keep the 4 moments alive. So we might put 3 targets, which could be cones, which could be goals, which could be mannequins. And if red player does intercept the ball, they quickly play to one of the targets to score a point. You could have a rule that every time the blue players get over and through the middle zone, they get a point. And if the red player is able to win the ball or intercept the ball, score it in the manner facing forward, they can wipe all the points for the players. So again, they might play through, the player goes and supports, and then it repeats the other way. And because we're repeating that way, we also need to put in at the other end of the practice 3 targets would replicate the 3 players in a game. So if that was a defending player or a midfield player, they're winning the ball, they're playing forward into maybe one of the midfielders or into one of the forward line. So again, it's keeping the game as live as possible, even though we're going to be heavily restricted in what we can do with our practices. And again, you could take this activity, you can remove the end player and put a target player in instead. You could remove the goals. You could put a age-appropriate goal in place, add a goalkeeper zone, through to the target player, and the forward blue player making the forward movement now has a strike on goal. In these practices at the moment, you're going to have to make sure that there's a clear zone for the goalkeeper, that the players aren't allowed, so that we avoid any situations. Keeper comes out 1v1 and smothers at the attacker's feet. So again, making sure players understand that only the goalkeeper can be inside that zone, and we must shoot from outside the zone. And the last one I'm going to touch on is again something around first touch and playing forward, and how can we keep PDE alive even without any defenders. So again, we might add a mannequin, or we might add multiple mannequins to really just think about where the player's taking their first touch, and gives them a reference to an opposition player and a reference to the game. So here, the player at the start are going to play back and forward, and they're going to attacker moves away and check backs in to receive. So it's actually the 2 players who are starting there, are playing across and shifting the ball side to side until they see the visual cue that the middle player is ready to receive. They play inside, and then they'll take their first touch. Now, as the ball moves to the inside player, the end player can move to one gate or the other. Now, the receiving middle player is going to have to make sure he understands where that end player is moving, because it's going to affect where they take their first touch. Then they take their first touch and play through to the end, and that finishes the practice. Or if you want to take it a step further, you could put an intercepting zone where we can position a defender, and they must stay inside that zone, because we can't put them in a situation where they're coming out to tackle, but they can definitely move across. And now what to do is the middle player, when they take their first touch, we can remove the gates, because that player now on the end is going to have to move to make sure they offer the middle player a passing option in the passing lane. So again, even though we're not using a tackler that can defend, by having a defender that can move through that intercept zone, it's still making sure that the position, which is going to affect the positioning of the middle player's first touch. And again, relates it back to the game as best as possible, even though we're taking into account the framework that Wendy outlined earlier in the webinar. So Dan, on my activities, what do you like and what could you offer other suggestions for the players?
So I think there's loads of, I think the main thing to take away, if you go back to that constraints led approach slide again, is that just with your mind, you don't actually physically have to take us all the way back there, is that Al's designing these practices to get what he wants, but it's using intercept zones, it's using target goals, it's using target players, it's changing the number of goals, it's changing the number of players. These are all things that we can play around with to get what we're looking for from the session. And I'd say it's all an experiment, as I don't know if anybody's ever coached under these circumstances before in our time. So as you're out there, don't be too harsh on yourselves as experiment, lay out the session, but be willing to pick up a few cones, pick up a few goals and shift them around to adapt to what you're seeing happening on the grass. So, yeah.
And on there, sorry, I didn't touch on, I should have done it before, is if you've got that intercept zone, again, when the player wins the ball, they've got to do something that's game relevant. They don't just stop or they don't just play it out, because we still want to try and keep the full movements alive as best as possible. So you put the defender in that, you might add 2 goals on the side that when the red player intercepts the ball, he can play into the target, which might be a midfielder finding a winger, for example. All right, what we'll do, we'll move on and we'll touch on if you're working now in the game training phase or with senior players. And again, I've just noticed an error on the screen, that should be 17 plus for the performance. And we can use passing practices and we can use modified positioning games. So again, really using an opposition, but about how we restrict the opposition to bring to life a game that's as close to the real thing as possible. And again, it's using defending zones to remove player contact and maintain physical distancing. So here's a passing practice that you could use. It's more of a general practice as opposed to one with positions. And again, we'll run through how it operates. So the blue players bounce the ball back. As they do that, the middle player checks away and comes back and receives, and then they play inside. The blue players then make a supporting run, one above the ball, one underneath the ball, and they combine to complete a third man run. Once they've completed that, the blue player then plays out to the red player at the top. Force the player at the end, player A, to play one way. So they're going to force them to play to player B or force them to play to player C. So they're going to press. In this example, we're going to force the player to play to the right-hand side of the pitch. So player A will play into player B. They will then combine to the top, where you've got another set of blue players waiting to make sure the practice flows back the other way. So again, it's getting contact on the ball. We can use this maybe as an extension of our warm-up, but we're also using limited opposition to force and pressure an opponent to play one way. So again, it's bringing to life some of the factors around the transition moment in the game, but making sure we're doing it in a controlled environment. And the key here is, again, youth players and senior players, making sure when they press the ball that they must remain that 1.5 metres away from an opposition player. But with this age, we can give them a little bit more freedom because they understand the concept a little bit more than our junior players. So there might be we're getting towards more of a game-specific practice in the game-specific area of the park. It can be who's dropped into that 10 can then play around the corner to combine with the 9, make a supporting run, and then play out to after the 9 clears the passing lane into one of the other options. And then the pattern repeats. Your 10 will move out, join the under practice. One of the players who's played in becomes there, and then the players will swap roles. So that 9 now really becomes the 10, and the 6 becomes the 9, and then you'll have another player really waiting to fill the space. And players will rotate in and out of the practice, and you could have some waiting zones to make sure we maintain physical distancing. We could get into a more specific passing practice. where we set up our team in our formation and we use mannequins or cones to set the opposition up in their formation. And now it's about us setting examples, and it might be setting 2 or 3 patterns of play about how they can progress the ball here from a centre back into a strike on goal. So it might be some way they combine to release a fullback in behind a pressing winger, and then how we combine with the 9 who goes and then shows to release a winger, to make a forward run for the 10 to break them behind to finish off from the cross. And again, that's just one example of a pattern where you might come up with 2 or 3, set the patterns, and then bring and allow the players to choose what pattern they want to bring to life. So they're taking their cue and their movement off what the player receiving the ball or the player about to receive does. And if you've got waiting players, because you've got more players in stations, here's a way you can do it. You can rotate a player between 9 and 10, a player between a 7 and a 2, and potentially if you've got another player, those players could rotate between a waiting player, a centre back as a 3, and a midfielder as an 8 or a 6. And those players will rotate through the practice. So Dan, anything there on passing practices you want to touch on before we move on to what I'm going to call modified positioning games?
Yeah, I'll just say, just because we're limited again by not being able to introduce opposition, is you can apply pressure through time. So maybe set a time limit that they have to get the ball to a certain zone before they deliver for a goal to be scored. Just be kind of creative about how, one, you stress test the play that you're looking for your team to perform, but also that keeps the players engaged because you're keeping them at a higher challenge point.
Cool. All right, and we'll move through to the last practice. And what I'm going to do is these are modified positioning games. So again, one that I'm sure many coaches have used before, where you divide the pitch into 3 teams and allocate them to a zone each. And then the key is about, if you've got that intercepting zone, you've got to have something for if the red team on screen win the ball, they're playing forward and they're trying to play through the line into their support players. So again, you could use mannequins, you could use cones, or you could use goals. So depending on what way the red win the ball, they've got a target in front of them to play through. It also means that the transition moment is alive, even though you're working on maybe you're defending compact shape. But also if blue do give the ball away, they've immediately got to transition into our BPO shape and try and prevent the reds from scoring. So again, you've all seen, and many of you have used that one, we play through or around the unit. So one thing here, and the consideration that I've want to put in is, we make sure when we play, we're not going to be able to have a pressing defender, but put maybe a middle line in that intercept zone. And then the player closest to the ball has to come across that middle point. And the other 2 players who are providing cover have to drop behind. And then if the ball's played wide, the closest player comes out above the line to replicate that they're pressing the ball. And then the 2 players come in and provide cover and then balance. So you're still keeping key defending principles alive, even though you can't have a live pressing defender. And again, if the ball was played back centrally, then you just adjust the shape, so on. Or they play wide, comes out of the line, presses like they're pressing the ball, but we're still staying in the intercept zone, and cover, providing balance. And again, something that coaches, I'm sure you've used before. You get something now that might be more specific to ball possession and build-out play. So the ball might start with a goalkeeper in a goalkeeper zone, and that keeper's the only one that's allowed to operate in there. To play through the intercept zone through the red defenders. Screen, they can block, they can intercept, and if they do intercept, they can take a touch forward and they can have an unopposed strike on goal. If now that the practice is finished and the ball's gone into the target, now's a chance to engage the red players and again keep the goalkeeper involved, so the goalkeeper's also getting action. So now might just play into the 9, but then it gets supported underneath by the 10 who takes their strike and finishes at the goalkeeper. And then the practice resets. So again, the practice is flowing both ways and all players are being involved. And the last one, again, is talking about having targets. So here, you maybe start at the other end of the practice, and it's about combination play and incisive play in central areas. The coach can play into a midfielder who can shift the ball, and they can use the target players on the side who can play back only before they can play through the two defenders. And then now the players can move to screen. Yeah, 10 has a strike on goal, or as the ball goes into the 9, it might be one of the wingers come inside for a third man run and they have a strike on goal. But again, we're using defenders and zones that are replicating parts of the game without them being in full contact. And then if the Reds do win the ball, again, they've got targets, or they could play into the coach, which keeps the transition moment alive and gives the blue players something to consider on loss of possession. So Dan, open it up back to you. This is just a couple of my ideas. What's your thoughts?
So I think if we look at the bigger picture here, like within youth or senior football, I think you call it the performance phase, right? Is that you'll either have a curriculum that you're working through, or you'll have a team training plan. If you're going to go play in the league this year, then you can start to see how these sessions, and under the current restrictions, is it feeds more into coming up against an opponent that's working in a block as opposed to a press, because we can't go and press because we can't be near them. So what you might think about doing is actually restructuring your curriculum or your training plan and having your current sessions at the moment aligned with going into defensive strategies or playing out against opponents that are playing in a block. And then by the time we get to playing against a press, maybe it's 2 weeks' time or whatever the timeline end up being, is the restrictions are removed and we can actually do that. So it doesn't impact our curriculum or our training plan for our team as much as it might do if we don't actually think about restructuring our bigger picture plan, I think.
Cool. Yeah, and I think before we bring this little part up to a close, I think there's something I just want to pull up on here. And I think there's something that we can't forget, that players have been without the game and been without a training environment for, multiple weeks and miss out on that team connection. I'm going to show you an activity which it's a few years old now. You'll see by some of the players in it at Bayern Munich now. Make sure players are enjoying and come up with enjoyable activities where players can just enjoy being back within football. Everything doesn't have to be structured. So we can maybe take something like this, the concept, but make sure you adapt it to make sure we keep physical distancing. And then again, just have the joy of players back being playing, because it's about that enjoyment factor. I think we're going to have players that they've missed out on. So again, just create potentially part of your sessions with just enjoyable activities, which people can have a laugh, can just have a bit of fun within. So again, I won't play the whole clip, but you'll see an idea of what potentially you could do as well. So maybe just another idea. Again, you might take something like that, but you'll have to make sure that maybe instead of the players going to do a group of physical work, that they do something as an individual base. So that after playing the ball, they might go off into 3 different directions, complete some sort of physical activity before going there. So again, I think Dan reiterated before, we're going to have to get creative. As a coach, we're going to be in an environment that we haven't been in before, and it's about embracing the challenge and actually trying to make good of it, because actually, by all these constraints that are placed on us as the coach, it gets us to be really creative, and we're going to try things. Doesn't mean it'll work, but give things a go. And make sure that when we're designing our practices, think about the constraints and physical distancing, Now we can use zones, and how we can use boundaries to keep players apart and keep players separate. Anything else, Dan? Maybe just around design?
No, nothing from me, mate. Just enjoy it. Just enjoy it and be adaptable. And yeah, I think we're all just looking forward to getting back on the grass after being locked up for too many weeks.
Yeah. And apparently, I think because we've got a number of people on tonight, I apologise if the internet's been a little bit slow, if it's caused a few problems for anybody. That's one of the things I guess we've just got to work through. So what we like to do is just bring up the last piece, and this might be more applicable to coaches who are working with players with game training in the later phases once they've been through peak height velocity, or in the senior space. And it's about how we make sure we're setting an environment which we're returning players and we're not putting them at risk of injury, and we're monitoring our workload. So over the weekend, we recorded a segment with Eleni, who was the strength and conditioning coach for Adelaide United W League team and is currently working with Adelaide Uni, and some of the considerations that you're going to need to make with coaches around the physical re-preparation of players. So Matt, if you can take it away. So welcome back, Eleni. How's things been in your world over the past few weeks since we were on our online workshop last time?
Pretty good. Some good news with the potential return to football. So a little bit more work for me, but yeah, really good and exciting, and thankful for the feedback I got from the last talk, and happy that some people have reached out via email.
Yeah, and I think we're now, compared to when we last talked, we're that step closer. We're now in a situation where we can actually return to the training pitch in a restricted capacity, but I guess in a restricted capacity is better than no capacity, and it means that we're a step closer to returning to games and returning to competition. So I appreciate you coming back and supporting our coaches network again, because I think there's a lot of factors design-wise that coaches are going to need to consider, but also for the players in the senior space and those players that have been through their maturation in our youth phase, there's going to be some considerations that need to do around physical preparation. And I think, do we look at it as a new season, a new pre-season training block, or do we just look at it as sort of that we're reconditioning players and how we top them up? So interested in your thoughts. So if I take it over to you and take it away.
Sounds good. And thanks for having me again, Alec. So I'll share the screen. Just checking that's all okay.
Yep, we've got you live.
Okay, awesome. So as Alex said, we are returning to football, but it's going to look very different. And there are a few things that we might need to do differently and we need to consider on return. Is it going to be pre-season all over again? Probably not, because we really don't know when we're going to start. We're going to assume, let's say, 4 weeks, but it could be longer. Or, we could extend it out a couple of months. We're not sure yet. So I've just prepared a couple of considerations from some of the things that I've seen around on the internet at the moment, from AIS, SASI have come out with some information, and then of course a lot of the private coaches like to have their say. And so I've kind of adapted a bit of everything from that, and everything that you see here is something that I would give my own players. I'm not giving stuff that I wouldn't give my own players, and also stuff that I haven't tried myself. I've even put myself through some of the return to sport training drills just to make sure that they're okay. And as I said in my last talk, my email address is there, and anyone is more than welcome to shoot through any more questions they might have. So I just want to start by making some assumptions for our return to sport. And I'm going to assume that at a senior level, or an elite senior level at NPL and WNPL, you probably sent your players home with some form of home program or some training plan with some guidelines on what you'd like them to do. How detailed it was, I'm not sure. I know I gave my players almost a step-by-step day-to-day program. But did they do it every single day? Well, no. They obviously had some other training or forms of training come up, or they just sort of slacked off a bit, which is natural in a break period. So we're looking more at that community level, where perhaps players weren't given much guidance or no guidance, and they've essentially had a real break from exercise and a break from football, and perhaps they were left to their own devices in terms of designing their own training routine and training plans. I'm also going to assume that players went for runs, and when you go for a run, we tend to go for a longer distance, so anything above that sprint pace. So we're looking at above 2 kilometers, and some players I've seen have been doing 10, 12, 15K runs. And we're going to assume, again, with wet weather as well, they probably haven't been doing them on grass, so your hard grounds, your footpaths, your harder running tracks. And again, returning out of football boots, they might have just gone into their old runners, and we might have a few issues that we'll talk about later. So I want to start by saying that we introduced a player survey at Adelaide Uni, the club I work for, and I would suggest that people do the same on Google form, free to use, free to access the answers. And it's basically a return to sports survey where we can reach out to the players and ask them how they feel and are they ready to come back to training, because we might be as coaches, but they've had a really different, unique type of break. And then from the results, we're going to base our training plan around what type of condition the players might be in on return. So some examples of questions you can ask your players in the survey. And I've just put mine, as you saw on the slide before, on a scale from 1 to 5, 1 being not prepared and 5 being very prepared. How physically prepared are you? And how mentally prepared are you? Because remember, some of them might have just completely checked out, or them, might be mentally drained, perhaps job losses and things like that. And then we want to know what types of exercise they did. So during the break, I did X amount of exercise, and you might have 0, 1, 2, or 3, 4 and beyond. So we want to find out how much vigorous, moderate and light exercise they did, and we can find that out by showing them the RPE scale, which I spoke about in my last talk, and I will touch on in this talk a bit later. We also want to know if they've completed any form of sprinting in the past few weeks. All well and good if they sprinted in week 1 of the break, but that was almost 6-7 weeks ago now. What have they done in the last few weeks, and are they ready to come back to training? And also an obvious one, have they been injured? Have they been sick? And what kind of comments do they might have, or any concerns? So we want to, injury prevention is always an emphasis, but it's even more of an emphasis now. And it comes back to the FIFA 11, which I did speak about in my last talk. Again, free access to this online, and for juniors, there's the FIFA 11 Kids. But we want to try and integrate this into a session, because there are restrictions now, and you might be pushed for training space and training time. So what would normally be a 90-minute session might be cut down to 60 minutes. So we're not going to spend 20 minutes on a non-ball warm-up. So how can we integrate this? Well, perhaps we've got some warm-up stations where the warm-up and the running around is done on the ball or with the ball, including passing and skills and things like that. And then we stop the players and we say, okay, you've got 20 seconds to go through some hops, or 20 seconds to go through some dynamic movements, or anything from the FIFA 11, from our normal warm-up, but we've integrated it as a whole, and we've used the ball as well to get the most out of our training time. If you're a club that has enough time and it's going to go back to normal, by all means go through your full warm-up like you normally would, because remember, we might need to tone down some of the sprinting and the jumping, which we'll talk about. So how can we, again, bring conditioning into football? Because of the restrictions and because of the numbers, we're going to be looking like small space or small-sided activities, but obviously with those social distancing rules still in place. So how can we add the conditioning without making that its own running on the running by himself, or how can we make sure that it's in a drill, as I said in the slide before. So again, perhaps during a drill, if the players need to return to the start of that drill, but there's too many players in that area, keeping in mind with social distancing, we might have them go out to their own cone or their own coloured cone and go through some conditioning whilst in that drill. So examples which we'll talk about, but they could go, and before they return back into the football drill, they have to do a 30-second plank or some jumps or some hops, or if you've got a wall nearby, a wall sit, or into a running conditioning drill. And load management, super important throughout this return to sport period. I did speak about it in my last talk, and I went into significant detail. So if you'd like to check that, go for it. And I introduced the RPE scale, which is this diagram here. So number one, keep on top of your players if you do have access to fitness tracking and GPS devices, but we're going to assume no. And then the second best option, the RPE scale, ask your players how hard they felt they worked, and use that, note that down, and use that to monitor their load throughout the week, and then throughout the weeks, and then the month before we return. We have to, this is going to become a common theme, we have to remember that we're trying to gradually increase. So if we have 3 sessions a week, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, we're not going to make Friday our toughest session. We might make Wednesday the toughest session, and we taper off on the Friday. So weekly increase, as in week 1 is set intensity, and then week 2, perhaps we go a little bit more, week 3, a little bit more. And then when we find out when we are returning, we're going to have to add a taper week. So remember, we kind of want to peak, which is hard to do when we don't know when we're returning. And then we want to taper off to replicate the game as much as possible and have them feeling fresh. So the first thing we'll touch on is aerobic conditioning. And again, another assumption, it could be unchanged. They could be, you know, as aerobically fit as they were when they left, especially if they're doing a bunch of running and a bunch of long distance runs. Their aerobic capacity might be great, but we could also assume it's going to be lower. There's no need to hurry back into our the condition that we were prior to the break. So a session that we completed before the break, we're not going to grab that and replicate it exactly the same post break, because we're going to see injuries, we're going to tire the players out, and it's not sustainable. For aerobic conditioning, with all your football drills, the players will start to naturally build that back up anyway. So in my opinion, to start with, there's no need for your isolated running drills. You don't need to give them ridiculous amounts of laps around the oval, laps around the pitch. Certainly no need for any crazy 2-kilometre time trials. It will build naturally. And then sprinting and higher speed running, again, assumption, it probably hasn't been done in the break. I can't really think of many players that would have gone out to a park, set themselves up some cones and pushed themselves really hard with sprints. The higher levels, yes, but perhaps not at that community level. So we need to safely reintroduce accelerating and the deceleration to players. So we'd like to start with a short distance, and then we build to longer. So if we flat out day 1 or day 2 say, let's sprint 100 meters, we're going to see your hamstring pings, we're going to see the tears, and then we're just in a lot of trouble. So I've tried to outline it in simple terms of what I will be doing and what some other coaches around Adelaide I've spoken to will be doing. So week 1, when we're sprinting, we might only go for distances between 5 and 20 meters, and at an intensity or a speed of 70 to 80% of that player's own maximal speed. And then week 2, we're building up, we've gone a little bit further, and perhaps we've increased the speed as well, increased the intensity. And then by week 3 and 4, we should be able to hit those longer distances, and we're working towards that 100%, getting ready for our match simulation. So I've put some examples together for the sprinting drills. Again, where we can, we want to integrate these on the ball. So it could be they do the ball skill and then they jump out and they come straight back. They do their sprint and then they come straight back in and you rotate over. So try to draw a little diagram here. The start line, players can run 5 meters and then slow down. Players can run 10 meters. They can sprint 15 meters, obviously 20. And again, around that 60 to 70 and then up to 80% initially and then building. We also want to remember that we want to introduce the slowing down element. So they might sprint 5 meters and then spend the rest of the time to the 10 meters slowing down. And then as we progress, it might be sprint to the 5 and then suddenly stop, or stop within 2 meters, or use 3 or 4 steps to stop. And that's rebuilding that decel and that deceleration. Really important, players need to do this at their own percent intensity. So if I set 70% and player 1 is trying to keep up with player 2, whose 70% is faster, then player 1 isn't at their 70, they're at their 80. So we can't restrict them. We can't say you've got 15 seconds to get to the end cone. We can say get to the end cone at your 70% and know that we are giving them a suitable amount of rest to wait for everyone to come back and then go again. And again, no target points. Try not to say reach this cone or reach a point past the cone in a certain amount of time. Because they're going to be pushing more than what they're capable of. And then if you're a coach that feels like 20 meters isn't enough, well, then let's extend it. So we can do longer. We can go up to 40, we can go 60 or 80, but we don't want to be sprinting the whole way. So we can cover a longer distance, but we might sprint in 10-meter intervals. So we sprint 10 meters, then we go back down to a jog, or perhaps a 50% you might set. Then we sprint again and then back down to a jog and repeat. So the next thing, change of direction, another assumption. We probably haven't done it in the break. We've probably just been running in a straight line, unless players have set up specific drills or they've perhaps been training with a partner. And again, gradual increase. So some examples, week 1, we might introduce a curved run or curving within a run to players, and I'll show a diagram next, and some lateral shuffles. So putting out 2 cones and just shuffling sideways between the 2. Week 2, we might increase the pace of the curve runs, perhaps ask them to get a little bit sharper around the cones, and we can start to introduce some decision making. So again, we can definitely introduce this in a football drill. And decision making, meaning they might have to react to a player, or they might have to react to a cone or a color of a cone that they hear. And then week 3, again, building decision making, perhaps some more reaction drills and at a faster speed. So getting ready for the games. Some examples here. Number 1, the weaving through the cones. So just cones set out, they could be 5 meters apart, 10 meters apart, up to you. We're not going at full speed. We're dropping it back, remember, at sort of their jogging or their build-up pace. And they're just starting, and my diagram here, a little bit loopy, but we're trying to go as close to the cones as we can, and they're running through and finishing up. And again, we could be football drill, but before you return to the football drill, weave through the blue cones and then return. And then they're getting that conditioning and they're coming back to the drill. And they're also not waiting one behind each other, not following the social distancing rules. And then you can start to build up the speed, increase the intensity, or perhaps start a player behind them quicker so they've got someone to run away from, and then that player's got someone to chase. And again, the lateral movement I was speaking of, the shuffles, just a couple of cones, 2 meters apart, perhaps 20 seconds on the stopwatch, 30 seconds, and they're just shuffling from side to side, planting the foot, pushing off, planting the foot, pushing off. No reacting just yet, just a simple introduction. And it's at their own pace. They're not trying to beat their partner, just whatever they can get done in the 20 seconds. Then as we start to move through the weeks, we might do a change of direction drill where they have to race a partner or they have to make some decisions. So an example here, I tried to draw it out. They would start on the middle cone and the partner would be facing opposite them, obviously 1.5 meters away. And the partner gets to dictate which way they want to run. They might run to this cone, so I have to run to the other cone, then swap to the other cone, and we finish racing each other back to the middle. So change of direction, decision making, because I now have to react to the opposite to what my partner's done, and a bit of speed, bit of intensity, replicating that short movement in the game. And I didn't add meters here, but you wouldn't be looking any more than 5 meters in between the cones, a total of 10 meters. And lastly, we've changed the direction when we start to speed up. Again, reactions, we've got a green cone and a blue cone. We start here, we must sprint to the red, and then they hear someone shout green or blue, and they run around and then end up at another cone. So change the direction here, change the direction here, and then a nice extended run or extended sprint to the end. And again, something you can do on the side before they return to a football drill. Or you can add the ball. They might be chasing the ball here. Next, we've got jumping and landing. And again, something that probably hasn't been done in the break. We also need to keep in mind that players are probably a little bit stiff and they've been sitting down, sitting on Zoom, uni lectures, working from home. Again, probably not doing as much exercise as they were before. So we can't go crazy without jumping and landing on day one. I've recommended perhaps include it in 1 session a week, but remember it is in the FIFA 11 and there is jumping and landing and hopping, so they're going to be getting some form of it anyway. We just have to make sure it's a gradual increase again. And again, into the rest break of football drills, we finish the drill or we've stopped, we've got 30 seconds, let's do some hops on the side. So I've tried to summarize a gradual increase for jumping and landing. And the emphasis is the landing. So we want to make sure when we land, our knees aren't going in all directions. We're not landing on our toes. You know, our feet aren't landing in opposite directions as well. And so for an introductory phase and all these exercises, you can pop into YouTube and find examples of them. You might do a broad jump or counter movement jumps, which basically sort of jumping on the spot. Hopping on the spot, and then some single leg hops and low reps. We're not doing this for 60 seconds on, could even be 5 each side. Intermediate, we might start to add hurdles, and again, hurdles can come into a circuit, and sideways or lateral hops, and then the single leg hops continuously. And then our broad jump, we might go, how far can we get, instead of just going for a small jump and a safe landing. Still want a safe landing, but can we add a little bit more power and try and get a bit further? And then obviously advance, we might broad jump and then jump straight up into a vertical jump. Reaction jumping, so again, might be colored cones, or they might need to react to you saying left leg or right leg. Jumping forward and then jumping sideways. And then obviously more hurdles. And now we can start to increase the speed of our jumps and perhaps the reps as well, if you like. So strength and functional stability. Again, we know that gyms have been closed, so we're going to assume that many of our players didn't have access to gym equipment. And they probably were following, if they're doing any form of gym work, probably following things like YouTube videos and body weight exercises, which can be good, but also there's a lot of silly stuff out there. Again, gradual introduction. And if you're following sort of the Carousel-like training plan that Alec mentioned, you might have a station that's purely on this stuff. So it could be non-ball related, or if you have access to a conditioning coach or an assistant coach that's willing to take it, you could have a 10-minute strength station where you do go through certain exercises that we know players probably ignored in the break. FIFA 11, obviously, again, it always comes back to that, has some of these exercises. Some examples, and again, happy to answer or send out any more examples via email. So isometric exercises, so any of the exercises where we're holding the movement, your planks, your wall sits, your low lunge holds, your Copenhagen planks for the groin, they can be good and they can be beneficial with 20 or 30 seconds work. You don't need to have a player doing a 2-minute plank. So I've put here in red, avoid the silly fitness and the silly conditioning. So in the breaks or in the rest breaks or in your conditioning stations, don't have your players doing, 1 minute of squat jumps, 1 minute of jumping lunges and 2 to 3 minute planks. It's just going to injure them, and they're not ready for it. Certainly soccer players aren't really doing that kind of stuff anyway, but they're certainly not ready for it after this extended break. And then obviously the main reason that we are talking about everything in the other slides is we want to avoid the injuries, and poor return to sport practices will lead to injuries. And I'll be completely honest, I am worried about the types of injuries that we're going to see, and worried that I've given my players enough, but have they done everything I had given them in the break? Have they done enough to set themselves up that they're going to be injury free during this time? Not the only one. I've spoken to a bunch of physios and coaches around Adelaide, and they're already starting to see injuries from in the break exercises, and they can predict the types of injuries that we're going to see after. Hopefully, if we do everything gradually and we keep open communication with our players and physios and whatnot, we're going to avoid some major ones. So I've just put some of the types of injuries that we might see as a result of a break, and they're very similar, if not the same, as the injuries that we would see after the main break and when we go back into pre-season. So number one, shin splints, especially in the females, or shin stress fractures and reactions, anything to do with repetitive force on a hard ground. So as I mentioned earlier, players that have gone for a run, they've gone for 8 kilometers of running. That's 8 kilometers that, which could take them, an hour or just a bit less, where they're just hitting the pavement. And again, poor footwear, they're returning to sport and we're making them run even more. We're going to see these kind of things. We'll see foot stress fractures, tendinopathies. I really hope we don't see tendon ruptures, but again, if a player has avoided sprinting for 6 weeks and they go out and sprint, we could be seeing a lot of Achilles issues and those kind of tendon issues. And again, the ones that we see all the time, hamstring, quad, groins, any soft tissue injuries that you get from going too hard too soon. And I wanted to touch on the shin splints and the shin stress reactions, because these, they're really horrible for players and we see a lot of them. And I've even kept track of our girls, and we had one player in particular that started to get symptoms about 4 weeks ago. And so we revisited everything she was doing, and she said, "Oh, I was just going for runs because I got excited and I can't really do that normally." And she brought this on herself. So we had to strip back her training, and much like what we did there, we would now have to do that to any other players that presented with these symptoms when we go back. So I've got a bit of a diagram here. We don't need to go into too much detail, but we know that there's some sort of mechanism going on with the bone and the muscle as a result of the repetitive force, and it's as a result of the running surface, a really big increase in running volume, and again, could be footwear. So if players are presenting with something like this, they'll know straight away. They'll say, "My shins hurt, I've got shin splints," or "My shins are tight." And you can ask them where it hurts, and it'll be in that sort of medial or the inside of the shin. That's a big warning sign. So again, physio, specialist, doctor, whatever they need, but we need to reintroduce them safely. And also, if someone has this particular type of injury, we might be pulling them out of a session 30 minutes earlier than their peers. And again, they might miss a session per week, or they might come out of a session early and then go onto the exercise bike or go home for some exercise bike training. Not the only injury that needs this kind of attention, but this is one that we expect we're probably seeing a lot of if players have just done that, going for runs and going for long distance runs. And again, I did speak about this in my last talk, and I went into significant detail, so feel free to have a read. Recovery, super important, can't stress it enough, especially if we're getting out of our training venues early. So perhaps we have to get off the pitch to allow another team to come on, and it's straight in the cars and straight home, no time for cool down and warm down. So we need to emphasize they need to do that at home. Focus on the basics. We don't need anything fancy. Sleep, good food, hydration. Remind players that they might have been eating a certain way and drinking a certain way during this break. Well, it's now back to football. We now need to rejig that part of their training. I did touch base in my last talk about the recovery points document, and I would suggest perhaps developing a set of guidelines or a set of points that they can accumulate with various recovery protocols, and they can have that at home, or if they're a bit younger, their parents can have it and keep them on top of it. So just to summarize, 3 key messages. Number 1, as I kept saying, we need to manage the loads and we need to gradually build up. We're not going to go in on week 1, day 1 and expect to be able to do what we did before the break. Some players might be super ready. They followed the home program perfectly, but we're going to assume there's a large number of players that didn't, and they need to be reintroduced. We need to communicate with players. So you might look into designing the survey, or just a phone call, or just asking if anyone has anything they'd like to say, or if they picked up any injuries, to please message or call before our first training session back. And again, emphasis on recovery. Super important. If we've lost the ability to warm down at training, they need to be doing it at home, and they need to be making sure that they've recovered, because again, we don't know when we're going to start the games. But if we get told a week in advance that we need to start a game, they need to be ready. They can't think that that's their recovery week. They need to be ready to taper and ready to go. And that's all from me.
Cool. Well, if you just close your screen down, thanks for another wonderful presentation. And there's a number of things that coaches will, as you've highlighted, will need to consider once the players are back in and back and working on the training pitch. And I think the 3 things I've taken away is know what your players have been doing first and foremost before you start anything with them. Get an idea of what they've done during the 7-8 weeks where we've not seen them. 2, bring them back into speed, agility, jumping and landing movements at a gradual rate, and don't put the workload on them straight away. So it'll build up over the first 3 weeks or so of your training. And then I think we're in a situation where we're going to have to be really careful and monitor player injuries, and we might see things happen because of the break that wouldn't normally happen in our normal season. Would that be fair?
Correct. Perfect summary. Yeah, definitely.
Cool. I'm interested in the fact that you talked. There's a couple of different assumptions that you've taken through. It could be a scenario where a coach comes back and some have done quite a lot, some have done maybe a little bit, and there's some that probably have done very, very little. So what would your advice? How do you manage that environment to make sure everybody's getting what they need in the same training session when you've got 3 players which are potentially at 3 very different levels?
Yeah, definitely. We approached this question as a coaching group just this last week, and we came up with the idea for the first few weeks, potentially looking at what the players or what answers they gave in the survey, and perhaps putting the players that have done a lot together to start with, sort of the medium return to sport players together, and then kind of that didn't do much or perhaps lower load coming back from injury together. So different groups to make sure that we can still train at an appropriate intensity. But then the hard thing with that might work for the first week or so, but then we need to make sure we build up the players that are still on the back foot so that they're ready with the higher players. So the integration will be really interesting. But again, I would say always try and work to, I guess, the players that haven't done enough. And the players that are up here, they're not going to lose anything drastic. You could give them extra work to do if they feel like they're not going to get enough. But I heard a really good saying from one of the coaches in Adelaide, and it was something along the lines of, you want to be giving your training sessions so that the players come back and say, are we doing enough? is this enough? It doesn't feel like enough. And that's the kind of attitude that we want to get back from the first few weeks, because you don't want them turning around and saying the opposite. Gee, they really smashed us this first week. I don't feel so good.
Yeah. So
hopefully that makes sense.
There'll be something about being on the precautious side and maybe under-training the players slightly as opposed to pushing them too far and overtraining them.
Yeah, definitely. And always, work towards, don't want to say weakest link, but work towards that player that might be struggling, because they're only going to get further apart if we keep building up the more advanced ones. So we just want to bridge that gap.
Yeah. And obviously we've both talked about tonight about how to incorporate the FIFA 11 into your training practices and into your warm-up. So I know what we're talking about now is very different to how you would have worked when you're in the season and in pre-season phases in the past, where you can use big games and small games and medium games as your conditioning. So all your conditioning's done in the football context. Mm-hmm. But you're talking about having almost recovery stations or preparation stations, and almost taking prehab into account in the middle of football-based activity. Would that be correct?
Definitely, yeah. All those exercises that are in our prehab or our warm-up, or I refer to the FIFA 11 a lot because that's the one that's most accessible. But there's no reason why we can come to training and we can get on the ball and include those exercises within it, rather than spending that chunk of time at the start. I mean, bands are, the resistance bands are one thing, and we obviously can't share that kind of equipment. So that might be something that players do in the 5 minutes prior to going out on the pitch. But all the other exercises, I don't see why we can't integrate them into a station. And again, it's perfect for a player to go at their own pace. They know that they're at their station, and they know that they might have to do a couple of lateral hops, but player 1 might do 8 and player 2 might do 20, because that's what they feel comfortable doing in that time.
And then could we say, once we get back into more training normality, as it would look like when we get to the next level, and we're resuming in competition where we can have contact between players. Mm-hmm. Would that be, you can take that same approach to be like, you might take some of those strength exercises from the FIFA 11 and just layer them into the practice, and it might be, right, we'll do the running warm-up, and then after the passing practice or in the passing practice, we might add 2 or 3 of the activities. After a positioning game, 2 or 3. After the game training, 2 or 3, and then finish off after the training game with any that's left over. And so we can spread them out through the session at little touch points. Would that be an approach as well you'd be comfortable using?
Yeah, perfect. In fact, it's probably something that my players would prefer, because I don't know about you and other players out there, but I know how long, like a long, tedious warm-up, it's horrible. So if my coach gave me the opportunity to do a passing practice and then said, okay, we've got 30 seconds rest, do this exercise or do this chosen part of the FIFA 11 in that break, why not? Or it could be drill's over, but before you get a drink, let's go 1 minute of this or a couple of these movements. So it'd be perfect.
So it's just as long as we're building them into the training session on a regular basis, it's just as satisfies it just as well as going, right, we're going to do them as a block work at the start of practice.
I'd say so. You'd kind of need to be smart about how you do it. Like you wouldn't say, okay, passing practice and now we're going to sprint. The sprinting might come a bit later once they've actually warmed up their running. And same thing, you wouldn't be saying, okay, we're going to do our major jumping movements straight after the first warm up, because they probably haven't warmed up the right joints and they're not ready to go for that. But again, gradual build up, and the harder, more demanding exercises could come once they feel warm, once they feel ready, and also not in the middle of a drill that's physically taxing itself. There's no point us being in a drill that's exhausting us and then going over to the side and having to do a bunch of jumps. They're just going to have fatigue and lactic legs. So
if you're talking about integrating here in our restricted training phase, that if you're sort of doing an activity where the players have played into a couple of combinations with another player, played a pass over 30 metres and then gone and sprinted, then you probably want to do something that's less intensive in that sort of preparation or prehab station on the way back to the start point. Would that be fair?
Definitely. Yeah, you wouldn't have them sprint the 30 and then do a curve,
Yeah.
80% sprint on the way back. It could be, something a little bit less taxing, less demanding on the way back, and leave it up to them. They're not going to do something, or we don't want them to feel like they have to do something that they're not ready to do. So if in that break they feel they have the ability to do this exercise, why not? Otherwise, perhaps we need to give them something else.
Yeah, so there needs to be a match, and how the prehab activity matches our football activity, and make sure that there's the right balance between how they operate.
Definitely.
Cool. Well, really appreciate you coming back and giving us some really important information that everybody in football is going to need to consider in the later phases of our game training, and definitely our performance phase in our senior footballers. Because I think, like you've touched on, if the danger is if we just presume or assume that they've done things over the break and put them straight back in, we are likely to see those injuries that you and your colleagues with the other strength and conditioning trainers and physios and doctors have talked about, which is going to lead to a longer return period for the player. So really appreciate you coming on board again, and good luck for everything once you're back out on the pitch. And I know sort of people will be that first session back, and for the first few for the week, I'm sure the banter is going to be pretty high. So enjoy, and look forward to catching up with you sometime in the future for potentially some more information that we can pass on to coaches. So
awesome.
Appreciate it.
Thanks, Alec.
And good luck with everything.
Thanks. Fingers crossed.
Cool. Cool. So again, thank you to Eleni for coming on and pre-recording that earlier and giving us some examples of how we safely return players. So that pretty much brings the workshop to an end. So I really just want to reiterate 3 key messages. One, as a coach, it's your responsibility to follow the framework, and we've got to do it as a collective group. And the better we do it, the better chance we've got to return to competition, and take it as a responsibility on yourself as the coach to be the role model the behaviour that you expect from other coaches in your club, and that the behaviour that you want from your players. We've referred to a number of our previous workshops that we've delivered tonight. So if you haven't seen these before, you can access those via Football South Australia. And you can have a watch in your own time. And we will be repackaging this and putting it up onto our Football South Australia YouTube channel. So you'll be able to post tonight, click back in and watch sections of the presentation that interest you. So hopefully tonight we've put together something for coaches, whatever level of the game you're operating in, from those players that are coming in and experiencing the beautiful game for the first time, to those coaches that are working with skill acquisition, with game training phase players, or working the performance phase or a senior phase with adults. So each coach, you're going to have to digest the information we've presented tonight and apply it to your own environment. And I'm sure that, like everybody, you'll look forward to getting back on the training pitch with your players. Good luck to you. And I think first and foremost, enjoy being back in a football environment, and make sure you structure it so everybody's enjoying themselves, because we've missed it. We've got a situation, we're back experiencing the beautiful game. It might not be how we're used to it. There's going to be some restrictions. Be creative as a coach and find out ways to develop your own practices, because you have to fall in line with our return to training framework. Otherwise, enjoy being on the grass, and we'll catch up with you soon, hopefully, and then we're not too far away from competition. Good night, and we'll be in touch.